The problem of death, taken from the Dornhorst Testament and also found in the book Easy Death by the Rishira avatar Adi Da Samraj. Among the most significant forms of human knowledge is the knowledge of death. The non-human beings experience fear, self-protectiveness, survival instincts, adaptation urges, sickness and death. But their involvement with all of that is at the level of urges, coming from the unconscious. The non-human beings are not, at the level of the conscious mind, very self-aware of death, its structure or purpose, or even its inevitability. Human beings, however, are even characteristically acutely aware of death as an inevitable and apparently terminal personal event. This awareness is unique, conditional knowledge, but it is also only partial conditional knowledge. It is a sign that human beings, not otherwise more fully awake, are yet functioning on the base of the unconscious relative to the larger context, real process, and ultimate purpose of death and of life itself. Thus, for human beings at the lesser or commonly characteristic level of human development, death is a problem, a threat, a dilemma, or a question in the mind. Because human beings function rather uniquely at the level of subconscious and conscious mind, and because human developmental progress is primarily a process in mind, moving ultimately toward the by me avatarically given revelation of self-existing and self-radiant consciousness itself, and only preliminarily and otherwise secondarily, a process of gross form and gross adaptation. Human beings naturally feel threatened by death as an always present or abstract possibility and concern of mind. Likewise, in general, human beings characteristically experience sex as an always present or abstract possibility and concern of mind, whereas non-human beings are generally associated with sex via instinctive and unconsciously generated cyclic patterns. Therefore, human beings are, in general, constantly moved to achieve sexual pleasure with or without an intention to reproduce, and they are otherwise, in general, constantly moved to confront and answer or solve, through psychophysical efforts, the abstract and really threatening problem of death. In contrast to the human species, the non-human species are generally moved only instinctively. Thus, non-human beings are instinctively moved to reproduce themselves excessively, that is to say, frequently and or in superfluous numbers, so that a sufficient number will survive all natural threats and reproduce the species again. And they are also instinctively moved to aggressively compete for food, territory, or breeding mates, who, like food and territory, basically represent the instinctive right to reproduce and they are otherwise instinctively moved to defend or even simply to agitate themselves only in the instance of direct confrontation with a really and bodily threatening physical opponent, whereas human beings in their more mentalized and therefore comparatively more developed personal and social state are, because of mental anxiety, sometimes moved to kill even their own kind in invented or mentally contrived wars, and otherwise to be aggressive and defensive and agitated even in circumstances that are not directly or really and bodily threatening. Therefore, human beings and mankind as a whole must develop further than all non-human beings, so that they may transcend all the mental, emotional, and physical exaggerations of their non-human inheritance of instinct, particularly as those exaggerations are demonstrated via egoic and loveless and destructive motives associated with sex and food and territory and aggression. It is also notable that as mankind develops its abstracted involvement with especially sex and death to the degree that most human individuals tend to live to and beyond the natural reproductive age, human populations tend to become overlarge, such that the quality of ordinary human experience and the possibility of growth beyond the first three stages of life become either threatened or really diminished. This indicates that as human populations acquire the capability for longevity, they must control human reproduction, and they must also become informed and guided by the wisdom culture of superior or really divine self-understanding and purpose, or else human beings will tend, in the likeness of non-human beings, to continue to reproduce excessively and to remain devoted in the instinctive or unconscious manner to self-survival rather than to self-transcendence or ego transcendence, and to effort and seeking merely for the sake of the survival of the organism itself, rather than to devotional surrender of the body-mind to the great reality and to the purpose of ego transcendence. The human populations achieve the capability for individual longevity. They must when human populations achieve the capability for individual longevity, they must control or transcend the instinctual reproductive strategies of excess, because those strategies work or produce an ecologically balanced result only if the rate of early life deaths is relatively large. Likewise, as human beings acquire longer lifespans, they must realize the superior or ego-transcending purpose of conditional existence, and they must be moved and grown to demonstrate that purpose in the context of the stages of life beyond the first three, or else conditional existence will be devoted to subhuman and egoic survival games and the petty territorial or political and social conquests that come from the increase of experience and knowledge and power in the lower human contexts of the first three stages of life, untouched by the great purpose and untouched by the culture the balancing effects, and the great process of awakening associated with ego transcendence in the context of the fourth stage of life and beyond. Therefore, as human groups increase in size because of the longevity of individuals, death itself must be really understood and transcended in consciousness and progressively in the context of the fourth stage of life and beyond. Likewise, merely reproductive sexuality must be controlled or economized in both its performance and its effort and its effects by various intelligent and heart-sensitive and compassionate techniques, and sexuality itself must be progressively converted and positively changed by heart-sensitive and love-based and energy-conserving and rejuvenative and eventually spiritually active and spiritually effective emotional sexual practice. For human beings, death is a proposition and a puzzle that must be understood and transcended by correct and revealing information or fullest education, and by the real process of ego transcendence. There is no peace for human beings until this matter is resolved. Of course, this matter of death is a perennial subject of conjecture and research, but the resolution of the question requires even more than information. As is the case with all truly developmental matters, this question can be resolved only by tapping what is always presently in the unconscious and bringing it into consciousness. That is to say, the overcoming of apparent problem and motivating stress associated with death requires the truly developmental and thus truly human and spiritual and transcendental and most ultimately divine process of positively changing and directly transcending the limitations of mind or the egoic burden of limited knowledge and limited experience. The unconscious is simply the totality of what is real, but not yet fully conscious or brought to fully conscious acknowledgement and realization. Since mankind has gone so far as to become subconscious or mentally and egoically self-aware about death, mankind must be surrendered to a process of becoming really and not egoically conscious of what is yet hidden. And this requires truly human growth and growth beyond the first three stages of life, via the human and spiritual and transcendental and most ultimately divine process of participatory ego transcendence. Through such ego transcendence, the presumed knowledge of the psychophysical potential of death progressively becomes heart realization of the self-sacrificial wound of divine love bliss. Deeper than the conscious mind of man in the third stage of life is the inherent practice is the inherent realization of eternal love, immortal love bliss, unqualified being, infinite spirit power, and inherent wisdom. Therefore, as the process of human growth develops beyond the third stage of life, there is developmental progress stage by stage toward most ultimate realization. And more in that progress, the problem of death, or the wondering about the purpose, process, and effect of life and death, is overcome by real conscious realization of what is hidden from the lesser, mechanical, and unconscious life.